Huawei just did something that 4 years ago almost nobody in Silicon Valley thought was possible. At the Huawei Developer Conference, held on June 12, 2026, the company confirmed that HarmonyOS has become China's second-largest smartphone operating system, overtaking Apple's iOS. According to Counterpoint Research, HarmonyOS now holds roughly 19% of the Chinese smartphone market, ahead of iOS at around 17%. With Android still in first place at close to 64%. That might sound like a small gap, but this is the 7th straight quarter HarmonyOS has beaten iOS on its own turf. And the trendline is what should actually worry Cupertino and Mountain View, not the single data point. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to May 2019, when the United States government placed Huawei on its entity list. Overnight, Huawei lost access to Google mobile services and the Android ecosystem that every non-Chinese smartphone maker depends on. Analysts at the time said Huawei's global phone business was finished. Instead, just 3 months later, in August 2019, Huawei launched the first version of HarmonyOS. That timing alone tells you this wasn't a panic reaction. It was a contingency plan that had already been sitting in a lab, waiting for exactly this moment. For years, HarmonyOS was still quietly built on top of Android's open-source code, and critics rightly called it a rebrand, with a new coat of paint. That changed in 2023 with the release of HarmonyOS NEXT, which tore out Android compatibility completely. No more Android apps running underneath. No more shared code. Huawei built its own kernel, its own graphics engine, its own security architecture, from the ground up. That is the version powering Huawei's comeback right now. And it's the reason this story stopped being a rebrand story and became an independent story. The phones driving this surge have names you've probably heard, the Mate 80 and the Enjoy 90 series. Counterpoint's own data credits these two device lines specifically for pushing HarmonyOS to its highest quarterly share in China since the fourth quarter of 2020, when it briefly touched 20%. On the software side, HarmonyOS 6 has now been installed on more than 66 million devices. And Huawei has publicly set a target of hitting 100 million installations by the end of 2026. At the same June conference, the company unveiled the next version, HarmonyOS 7, built around what they're calling an Intelligent Agent Framework 2.0, which Huawei claims can complete assigned tasks with a success rate above 90%, along with a performance jump of more than 15% over the previous build. The stable public release is expected later this year alongside the Mate 90 series. Globally, HarmonyOS sits at around 5% market share across all device types. That's up from 3% just a year earlier, which is real growth. But Android is still sitting comfortably at roughly 73% of the entire planet's smartphones. This is not, despite what a title like R.I.P. Android might suggest, a global takeover happening right now. What's happening right now is a China-shaped hole being carved out of Android's empire, and that hole is expanding fast. But the walls around it are still very much standing everywhere else. Why does the wall exist? 2 words. App ecosystem. HarmonyOS NEXT dropped Android app support entirely, which means every single app has to be rebuilt natively for the platform from scratch. Inside China, that's manageable, because WeChat, Alipay, Baidu, Meituan, Weibo, JD.com, Taobao, and Bilibili are already natively optimized and available on day one. Outside China, Huawei is missing the apps that international users actually build their phone habits around, things like Spotify and Netflix, largely because of the same US-China political freeze that created this whole situation in the first place. You can build the most technically elegant operating system on Earth, but if the rideshare app, the banking app, and the streaming app people already rely on aren't there, most users simply won't switch. That's the wall Microsoft's Windows Phone hit. That's the wall Samsung's Tizen hit. And it's the wall HarmonyOS still has to climb outside its home market. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about, and it's arguably bigger than the smartphone numbers. China has an official government policy called Xinchuang, which loosely translates to Information Technology Application Innovation. Under this program, Chinese government agencies and state-owned enterprises have been directed to replace foreign operating systems, foreign chips, and foreign enterprise software with domestic alternatives by the end of 2027. This isn't a marketing campaign or a patriotic nudge. It's a procurement mandate, and it applies to an enormous slice of China's economy, from banking to telecommunications to energy. HarmonyOS is one of several domestic platforms benefiting from this, alongside Linux-based alternatives like OpenKylin. But Huawei's vertically integrated approach, from its own Kirin chips up through the operating system itself, makes it the most visible face of that shift. So where does this actually leave Android and Google? Not dead, not even close, not globally, but genuinely tested for the first time in over a decade. Huawei has proven, with real, verified, third-party audited numbers from Counterpoint Research, that a company completely cut off from Google's ecosystem can still build something tens of millions of people choose to use every single quarter. That's a real crack in a wall that Silicon Valley spent 15 years treating as unbreakable.
Huawei just published a patent that stopped chip engineers around the world in their tracks. On December 6, 2025, the company that America banned from buying the world's most advanced chip-making machines showed a possible way to build 2-nanometer chips without them. This is the shock announcement now shaking the global tech industry, and here is exactly what happened. To understand why this matters, you need to go back to 2019. That year, the United States banned Huawei from buying chips made by TSMC in Taiwan. Then, in 2022, the Netherlands blocked ASML, the only company on Earth that builds UV lithography machines, from selling to China. These machines cost more than $150 million each. They use light with a wavelength of just 13.5 nanometers to carve patterns onto silicon. Without UV, the whole chip industry believed nobody could build chips smaller than 7 nanometers. Not as a business problem, as a hard wall in physics. But Huawei kept breaking that wall anyway. In 2023, it released the Kirin 9000S, a 7-nanometer chip that experts said should not exist. In 2025, the Kirin 9030 pushed close to 5-nanometer performance inside the new Mate 80 phones. Both chips were built using older Dove machines, deep ultraviolet tools that use light at 193 or 248 nanometers. That is like trying to draw a hairline crack with a marker 10 times too thick. Huawei somehow kept doing it, and that track record is exactly why this new patent has people worried. The patent is called Metal Integration Method for Manufacturing Integrated Devices. It was filed on June 8, 2022, but stayed hidden until it was spotted by semiconductor researcher Dr. Frederick Chen and made public in December 2025. Inside it, Huawei describes a technique called SAP, short for Self-Aligned Quadruple Patterning. Instead of using one UV exposure to draw a fine pattern, Huawei's method uses Dove machines to build the same pattern in 4 careful passes, using spacers and hard masks to keep everything lined up at the atomic level. And here is the twist. This method does not need a single UV machine. So, can Huawei actually pull this off? The numbers tell a complicated story. TSMC currently gets about 90% yield on its 7-nanometer chips using UV. That means out of every 100 chips made, 90 work. Huawei's partner SMIC, using DUV multi-patterning, gets closer to 50% yield at 7 nanometers. And that drops to around 30% at 5 nanometers. Push that same process to 2 nanometers, where a single speck of dust can ruin an entire wafer, and industry analysts think yields could fall as low as 10 to 15%. That means most of the chips coming off the line would fail. Each working chip becomes extremely expensive to make. So why would China even try this? Because for Beijing, this was never just about profit. It is about technological sovereignty. China has already poured tens of billions of dollars into building chip independence because it does not want its phones, cars, and military systems depending on machines controlled by other countries. If the government has to subsidize expensive, low-yield chips for years to reach that goal, it will. This is a long game, not a quarterly earnings report. Now compare that to what TSMC is doing at the same time. TSMC's own 2-nanometer process, already shipping to customers like Apple, uses advanced UV lithography with high numerical aperture optics and something called gate-all-around transistors. TSMC has spent more than $40 billion on research and new factories for this alone, and it is expected to hit 85 to 90% yield almost immediately. Huawei's Dove path is the opposite, slower, riskier, and far more expensive per chip, but it does not require a single banned machine. That is the entire point. Here is where it gets bigger than just one patent. TSMC controls close to 60% of the global chip manufacturing market and nearly 90% of the most advanced chip production on the planet. Its customers include Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and Qualcomm. If Huawei manages to build working 2-nanometer chips, even at a higher cost, it opens the door to supplying China's own massive market of 1.4 billion people, companies like Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, Bide, and Alibaba included. That is a huge slice of global chip demand that could quietly shift away from Taiwan. A patent is just paper. It is not a factory, and it is not a finished chip. Right now, there is no public evidence that Huawei has actually manufactured a single working 2-nanometer chip using this method. History shows that the gap between a patent filing and real mass production usually takes 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer for something this complex. TSMC did not become the world leader overnight either. It took 30 years and relationships with more than 600 suppliers around the world to get where it is today. Huawei would need to build that same kind of ecosystem almost from scratch, including ultra-pure chemicals, specialized coatings, and thousands of trained engineers. There is one more piece of this story that changes everything if it works out. Reports say China has also been quietly testing its own homemade UV machine at Huawei's facility in Dongguan. Instead of copying ASML's exact method, this Chinese machine reportedly uses a different process called laser-induced discharge plasma. Trial production was expected around the third quarter of 2025, with a full rollout possibly landing in 2026. If that machine actually works at scale, it would break ASML's complete monopoly on UV technology, and the Dove patent trick would become just a stepping stone on the way to something far bigger. So is TSMC actually in trouble right now? Not in the next 2 or 3 years. Its technology lead is safe, its biggest customers are not going anywhere, and it is already shipping real 2-nanometer chips today. But the story around what is possible has clearly shifted. A few years ago, experts called advanced chips without UV flat out impossible. Now, the same experts are calling it merely unlikely. And Huawei has already turned unlikely into reality twice before. First with the 7-nanometer Kirin 9000S, then with the 5-nanometer class Kirin 9030.